Hey guys, welcome to Crater Mania. I'm your host, the man they call Crater, and I'd like to welcome all of you back to my 500 movies in 2025 series. And for today's episode, this will be movies number 313 through 322. And today's episode of the 500 movies in 2025 is a very special subject for me personally, um, because as of yesterday was August the 30th, 2025. And on yesterday, we celebrated the 228th birthday of a very special lady that just has inspired a lot of not only the goth culture, but just horror in general. And that's Mary Shelley. Um, Mary Shelley was a pioneer when it comes to horror literature, and just a huge inspiration for me personally. And if it wasn't for her, we wouldn't have got one of the greatest characters of all time, and that's the Frankenstein monster. And on tonight's episode of the 500 movies in 2025, we're going to be going over 10 different movies. 10 movies tonight that were inspired from by the original novel by Mary Shelley. Um, so I just wanted to talk about Mary Shelley just a little bit before we get into talking about the movies tonight. You know, Mary Shelley's life was a just a work of gothic fiction in itself. You know, just a tempest of intellectual brilliance, profound loss, and a romantic scandal that just directly fueled her monumental contribution to literature. I feel so she was born to her parents were Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin, and Mary Shelley was just destined for an unconventional life. But few could have predicted, that long dark shadow that she would cast over modern culture. Um, her masterpiece, Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. It just conceived. It was conceived during a ghost story challenge in 1816. It was far more than just a simple horror tale. It was a revolutionary act. At just 18 years old, Mary Shelley, bypassed that era's ghosts and goblins to create, a new kind of terror, that was rooted in, this kind of scientific pride almost, and just in this kind of this dread about it. She pioneered that genre of science fiction, and gave horror, one of its most enduring themes, and that the monster is not the creation, but the creator. So the novel's psychological depth, exploring isolation and prejudice and just the responsibilities of power. It remains its most terrifying and resonant aspect. Victor Frankenstein's ambition, and his creature's tragic loneliness are the true sources of the horror. Um, and this master work of Frankenstein, it cemented Mary Shelley as the reluctant, godmother of the whole goth culture. The novel's DNA, the brooding, tormented genius, the sublime and desolate landscapes, and the sympathetic yet monstrous outsider, and just the morbid obsession with life and death. That became these kind of foundational pillars of the whole gothic lifestyle. Her own life, marked by the early death of her mother, the loss of her children, and then also the tragic drowning, of her husband Percy. It infused her work with just this kind of authentic melancholy that just continues to captivate, years and years and years afterwards. And Mary Shelley did not just write a monster story. She gave voice to just the darkness within ambition, and the just the tragic beauty of being an outcast. And so, and just she just ensured that her legacy haunts us to this day. And that's why we're celebrating her birthday. Or her birthday was yesterday, but we're celebrating that here tonight. And this whole month actually for the 500 movies in 2025 has been awesome. I've loved this month, and I just thought that this was just a perfect way to end the month of August by celebrating the life and the works of and the films that were inspired by her work. Um, so let's go ahead, I guess, jump into that tonight with the first. Well, typically, what I would do is I would go down films one by one with my reviews. Um, but these first seven films that I'm going to be talking about tonight, so I'm going to kind of like bunch them all together because they are the Hammer horror Frankenstein films. So there were only seven, so I'm going over all of these at once. And most of these films are films by Terrence Fisher, with Peter Cushing starring as Victor Frankenstein. But like I said, I'm just going to bunch these all together because there is a lot of movies I got to go through tonight. So I'm just going to try to go through this as quickly as I can. Um, so there are certain, cinematic universes that feel less like a collection of films and more like a kind of a cherished, although very macabre, like family history. So so for those of us who have kind of found our gothic sensibilities awakened in this blood red glow of a British film studio, the Hammer Horror Frankenstein series is not just a cornerstone of the genre. It to me it's like a sacred text. It's a 7-part examination, not of a lumbering creature, but of the brilliant, obsessive, and terrifying human soul of its creator, Baron Victor Frankenstein. And revisiting these films is like witnessing the birth, the evolution, and just the that ultimate damnation of one of, I think, cinema's greatest anti-heroes. It's a role that's so definitively inhabited by Peter Cushing that all other portrayals kind of feel like mere echoes. Um, and you got to remember, like around this time, Peter Cushing was such a huge star in the world of horror. And this is one of his most defining roles. And Mary Shelley's novel was the seed for this series. And James Wells' Universal classics, were just the magnificent kind of towering oak tree or something. If I'm using kind of a example that this kind of first grew from it. But what Hammer Films and director Terrence Fisher did with 1957's The Curse of Frankenstein was just something else entirely. They took that seed, planted it in fresh, blood-soaked soil, and just cultivated a new, intoxicatingly beautiful species of horror. Where Universal gave us this kind of parable of a sympathetic monster, and a misguided, if ultimately, repentant, scientist. Hammer flipped the narrative, on its head here, and in their world, the creature was a tragic, often pitied, consequence. But the true monster, the magnetic, horrifying, and utterly, compelling center of this universe was the Baron Victor Frankenstein himself. Um, and it's impossible to overstate the impact of the Curse of Frankenstein. Emerging from the black and white gothic mist of its predecessors with Universal, It burst onto the screen in kind of this riot of color. This wasn't just a stylistic choice. It was a statement of intent. The crimson of spilled blood, the lurid green of laboratory chemicals, the sickly pallor of dead flesh. It was all there, just rendered with kind of this shocking, vibrancy that audiences had never seen, in a horror film. And this was horror made visceral, immediate and beautiful. Um, and at its heart, are two legendary performances that would define a generation of horror. Peter Cushing's Baron is, from his first appearance, a figure of kind of chilling intellect and just this kind of aristocratic, arrogance. He's not a madman in the cackling, wild-eyed sense. His madness is a very cold and calculated byproduct of his genius. He speaks of his unholy ambitions with the same calm, rational tone that one might use to discuss, the weather or something. Um, his cruelty is not born of malice, but of a complete and just utter disregard for anything, morality, friendship, love, this anything that stands in the way of his quest for knowledge. And so when he calmly pushes, the esteemed Professor Bernstein from a balcony to secure a superior brain for his creation, it's a moment of just kind of breathtaking amorality that just sets the stage for the entire series. And then there is Christopher Lee's Creature. So, denied the iconic flat top silhouette, that was Karloff was known for, just due to copyright. The makeup artist here, Phil Leakey, was forced into a kind of originality, and just the result is arguably, I think, more horrific. Christopher Lee's monster is just a true patchwork man, a grotesque, assembly of just mismatched parts. One eye clouded and dead, the other filled with a perpetual, agonized confusion. He's not a creature of, in the same way as Karloff's was. He is just a being of pure, instinctual suffering. And his brain, is damaged during the creation process. It's left him this kind of twitching, violent wreck. And so he's really just this walking, catastrophic failure, which is a testament to the Baron's pride. And the tragedy here is not that of, a gentle soul that's wrapped in monstrous form, but of a being born into nothing but pain and confusion. This a living, breathing embodiment of this botched experiment. And Curse of Frankenstein is just the perfect, brutal opening statement. And this is a new age of horror, and its name is Hammer. So that leads me now to the next film in the Hammer Frankenstein series. So, I mean, and how do you follow a film like The Curse of Frankenstein? That it really redefined a genre. So, with The Revenge of Frankenstein, Hammer answered with this kind of audacious confidence, crafting this sequel that is not only equal to the original, but in some ways kind of more thematically sophisticated. So, escaping the guillotine at the end of the film from Curse of Frankenstein, with this help of this hunchback assistant, Carl, Frankenstein sets up a new practice in Carlsbrook under the alias Dr. Stein. And this is a baron who has learned from his mistakes, not the moral ones, but just the practical ones. So now he is smoother, more charming, and his ambition has only intensified here. And the central conceit is brilliant. In exchange for his help, Frankenstein promises Carl a new, perfect body. Um, and the subsequent brain transplant gives us a new kind of creature, played with this remarkable nuance by Michael Gwynn. So when Carl, awakens in his, handsome new form, he is, articulate and whole, a true success. But the victory is short lived. So the body begins to fail, his limbs are contorting back into their old crippled shapes. His mind, which was once sharp, now descends into this kind of cannibalistic rage. And this is a far more complex horror than simple monstrosity. It's the horror of reversion, of going backwards, of the flesh betraying the mind, of just the past, physically reasserting itself on the present. So yeah, it's messed up. But the masterstroke here with this film is the ending. So he's beaten to death by his own patients. Victor Frankenstein, or Baron Frankenstein's final revenge, is the ultimate act of creation, and that's self-resurrection. So his faithful assistant Hans transplants the Baron's own brain into a new body, and he emerges once more in London, reborn as Dr. Frank. And it's this kind of stunningly cynical and perfect conclusion, I feel, which really just established, the Baron not just as a creator, but, as this kind of force of nature. You know what I mean? Just an idea that cannot be killed, is forever destined to kind of perpetuate, his own monstrous cycle. Um, and so that brings me to the next film in this series, which which was after a 6-year hiatus. The Baron returned in a film that stands as the curious outlier of the series. So the Evil of Frankenstein is often seen as the weakest link in within the first three films in the Hammer Frankenstein series, and honestly, it's not hard to see why. I mean, so kind of due to this new distribution deal with Universal, Hammer was now able to borrow elements from their classic films. So, and the result here in The Evil of Frankenstein is a very strange hybrid. Um, the creature here was played by Kiwi Kingston. He kind of sports this very blocky, Karloff-esque look, and the plot, involves this corrupt hypnotist and this mute, sympathetic girl, and it feels kind of like a rehash of older horror themes rather than just kind of a continuation, of Hammer's unique vision. Um, and Peter Cushing's Baron is also kind of subtly, different here. He's less that proactive, amoral mastermind, and more of a victim of circumstance. He's a man that's returning home to find, his legacy is stolen. Um, his creation has been co-opted. The film's most powerful moments come from Frankenstein's, discovery of his original creation, which is perfectly preserved in a glacier. So there is kind of a flicker of, paternal pride, even affection, in his eyes as he thaws the creature out. But the true villain of the piece is this hypnotist Zoltan, who seizes, control of the monster for his own petty revenges. And while it lacks that kind of sharp thematic focus of its, the previous films, and its successors, honestly, um, the Evil of Frankenstein remains this very fascinating entry, in my opinion. It's a moment um, where the Hammer series, kind of looks back at its own inspiration, even if the resulting reflection was a little muddled. But yeah, so now moving on to the next film in that series, which, if the Evil of Frankenstein was a step sideways, Frankenstein Created Woman, from 1967, was a kind of a leap forward into profound, poetic, and just, deeply strange territory. Um, and honestly, personally, this is where I really started getting super interested in the Hammer series of Frankenstein films. Um, you know, and I think with Frankenstein Created Woman, this is arguably, one of the top masterpieces of this series. Just a film that just largely, abandons that visceral horror of, stitched together bodies for a more exploration of souls and memory and identity. So here, Peter Cushing's Baron, is at his most detached and godlike. He has, conquered the reanimation of the body. You Now his obsession is the trapping and transference of the soul itself. And he works with an almost serene, philosophical curiosity here. Viewing human life and death as just mere variables. In his grand equation. So the film's plot is just pure gothic tragedy. When his young assistant Hans is wrongly executed for murder, Hans' lover, the cruelly disfigured, emotionally scarred Christina, drowns herself in despair. So this is where the Baron's genius, takes its most audacious turn. He not only resurrects Christina, repairing her physical scars, but he also transfers, the vengeful soul of Hans into her beautiful remade body. So the result is a creature, unlike any other in the series. You have this beautiful woman possessed by the spirit of her wronged male lover. So as she or he, however you want to perceive them, sets out to exact this terrible, seductive revenge on the three wealthy thugs who framed Hans. And the film kind of delves into these kind of themes of gender identity and cosmic injustice and just the nature of the soul. And that's what was so interesting. It was such a very different Frankenstein film. And it was all these films that I spoke of so far have been directed by Terrence Fisher, and just it was just a lyrical beauty of a film. Just watching this kind of lush, romantic colors. And Frankenstein Created Woman is just a very mature, melancholic and just unforgettable work of art. I feel, it's a film that really proves, the Hammer Frankenstein series was capable of much more than just simple shocks. It could be truly profound. Um, which now brings me to one of my absolute favorites in the entire Hammer horror Frankenstein series. And just as audiences may have started to see the Baron as a detached, almost neutral force of scientific inquiry, Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed arrived to remind us of his infinite capacity for monstrosity. And this is without question the film where Baron Frankenstein is at his most irredeemably evilness. It is Peter Cushing's finest hour in the role, in my opinion. Just a portrait of pure narcissistic obsession that is just terrifying to behold. And the plot is just pure thriller. So Frankenstein, he's a fugitive and just he blackmails a young doctor and his fiance, into helping him. And his goal is to save the mind of a brilliant but insane scientist, Dr. Brandt, by transplanting his brain into another body. And from the outset, the Baron is a whirlwind of just cold blooded cruelty. So he just casually murders and ruthlessly just blackmails. And, in the film's most controversial, I think, and shocking scene, he brutally rapes his assistant's fiance, not out of lust, but just as a horrifying assertion of dominance and control. And it's really messed up. It's wild. But it's a deeply uncomfortable moment, but one that cements, I think, the character's descent into just absolute depravity. He is no longer just unburdened by morality. He is actively hostile to it. Um, and the film's kind of central tragedy belongs to the new creature, the brilliant mind of Dr. Brandt trapped in this body, of another man. And this is just a heartbreaking performance by actor Freddie Jones. So when he awakens, his first concern is for his wife, only to discover that she is terrified of the stranger that he now inhabits. And his desperate, attempt to reconnect with her is one of the most devastating sequences, in the entire series. So in the climax, in which Brant's wife, unable to reconcile the man that she loves with the monster before her, dooms them all, is this perfect tragic conclusion. And Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, I think, is probably the darkest and most psychologically brutal entry in the entire saga. It's super well made. The story is so compelling with this one. I mean, I just like I said, it stands out as one of my absolute favorites in the entire Frankenstein Hammer horror series. Um, it's just this kind of relentless character study of a genius who has finally and just irrevocably sacrificed his last shred of humanity on on the altar of his ambition. Um, and that leads me into the first film in the Hammer horror series that was not starring Peter Cushing or directed by Terence Fisher, and that's The Horror of Frankenstein from 1970. Um, so the 1970s saw Hammer attempting to reinvent itself for a new, more permissive era, leading to the two final and very different installments. So the Horror of Frankenstein is basically like a reboot. It's a black comedy remake of the original Curse of Frankenstein. Um, and this film is absolutely one of my favorite Frankenstein films. Period. Um, but with and as much as good as the other Frankenstein's films are in the Hammer horror series with Peter Cushing, um, Ralph Bates here in this one as Victor Frankenstein is just amazing, and just the way they portray the character in this one is it's really, really different. So, with Peter Cushing absent, like I said, the role is taken up by Ralph Bates, who portrays Victor as a younger, very lethally charming sociopath. So he murders his own father for the inheritance, and he's sleeping with every woman in sight, basically, and just assembles his creature with this kind of detached, almost bored amusement. Um, and the film is just knowingly campy and satirical, which is a product of its time, and while it lacks the that kind of gothic weight of the Cushing films, it's very entertaining and just a very witty experiment. David Prowse, who would later become Darth Vader in the original trilogy of Star Wars, just makes his first appearance here as the creature. This physically imposing but less tragic figure than its predecessors. It was only fitting, however, that the saga should end, though with its true star, and that brings me to the last Frankenstein film in the Hammer horror series. So Peter Cushing returned for this last performance in 1974's Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. And just what a finale that it is. The film is grimy and claustrophobic and just deeply melancholic. So, hiding out as the resident surgeon in this insane asylum, the Baron is now a weary, just kind of physically broken figure. His hands are just terribly burned and and useless, and yet the fire of his obsession is still raging. With the help of this young disciple, he constructs his final monster, which is again played by David Prowse, from the inmates of the asylum. And this is probably the most grotesque and pathetic creature of the entire series. Just this hulking simian brute with the brain of this mathematical genius is just a truly pitiful sight. The makeup is kind of very stomach churning. The performance one of just pure, animalistic agony. The film is just a grim meditation on failure and decay, and the asylum is the perfect metaphor for the Baron's mind, which is a place of madness and suffering from which there is no escape. And the final scene where the monster is torn to pieces by the asylum's inmates is not a moment of triumph, but just really one of profound sadness. Frankenstein simply turns away, ready to start again. His spirit just unbroken, but his world has collapsed into this one miserable, hellish institution. And it is a bleak but yet powerful and utterly fitting end to the story, of a man who flew too close to the sun, honestly, and just spent a lifetime stitching together these scorched remains. And to look back on the Hammer Frankenstein series is to see more than just a collection of horror films. It is to witness a singular, sustained character arc across 2 decades. It's the story of Victor Frankenstein, a man whose genius was his defining grace and his ultimate curse, honestly. Um, and through Peter Cushing's kind of immaculate performance in the majority of the Hammer Horror Frankenstein series, he evolved from this kind of arrogant aristocrat to a cunning fugitive, a detached philosopher, just an absolute monster of a man. And finally, this broken but, relic of a man. And the creatures came and went, each kind of a mirror reflecting a different facet of their creator's psyche. But the Baron remained that constant, blazing, dark star of the series. And this was a series that dared to make its kind of central protagonist here a villain, and not just any villain, but one we couldn't help but be just fascinated by. It pushed the boundaries of cinematic gore, but its true power lay in this kind of psychological and philosophical horrors. It asks terrifying questions about the nature of identity, the price of knowledge, and just, what it truly means to be a monster. And for the fan in me, and just for countless others, out there that are fans of the Hammer horror series, the Hammer Frankenstein saga is not just classic horror. It is grand gothic tragedy of just the highest order. And its dark, brilliant heart, I think, will beat for all time. So definitely check out the Hammer horror series, the Hammer Frankenstein series, and there's so much more Hammer horror out there. And here in maybe a few months, we'll talk about some more of those films. But that brings me next to the film on this list outside of the Hammer Horror Frankenstein series. Um, so this next film that we talk about has been one of my favorite comedy horrors. You could call this a comedy horror for sure, just based off the elements within it. For the longest time, ever since I was a kid, and this is quite possibly one of my top favorites from the director of this films. And this is Young Frankenstein from 1974. And there are comedies, and then there is Young Frankenstein. So, to call it merely a parody is to really do it a profound disservice. So Mel Brooks, in 1974, he created this masterpiece that is not just a spoof of the classic Universal horror films of the 1930s. It is this meticulously crafted, deeply affectionate love letter to those Universal horror films of the 1930s. It is a film that so perfectly, understands the source material that is it satires it becomes this legitimate, spectacular entry into the very canon that it lampoons. You know what I mean? Like as a lifelong admirer of Mel Brooks, and just a huge fan of Gene Wilder and just his brilliance in film. as an actor, and just someone who considers this film just a cornerstone of cinematic comedy. I can say that Young Frankenstein is like a lightning in a bottle. It's a perfect storm of talent and timing and just the vision that has not been and likely never will be replicated. So the film's genius begins with its kind of foundational concept, born from the mind of Gene Wilder and just brought to life by, the director here, Mel Brooks. So their previous collaboration, Blazing Saddles, was released in this same year. And, it was a fourth wall breaking, this explosion of anarchic humor. And Young Frankenstein is a work of just exquisite restraint, and discipline. And Mel Brooks, made that choice to shoot entirely in black and white, which is a move that was kind of commercially risky, at the time in, the kind of color saturated 1970s. But this decision was crucial, and it is what makes this film so appealing to so many people. It instantly immerses the viewer in that gothic, shadow drenched world, of James Whale's 1931 Frankenstein. And this commitment to authenticity extends to every frame of the film. So Mel Brooks employed these kind of 1930s style scene transitions, like, iris outs and wipes, and just that they used to do, the little things they used to do in the original Universal films. And John Morris's kind of like beautiful score could easily be mistaken for this kind of lost composition that was from, that whole golden age of horror. And, the most incredible touch, I think, is a testament to, the production's reverence for its roots was the use of the very same laboratory equipment, the crackling, buzzing electrical props that, created by Kenneth Strickfaden, I think is how you say his name, that really brought Boris Karloff's monster to life. This isn't mockery; it's resurrection. The film doesn't just make fun of the old horror movies; it lovingly recreates their soul, and then injects it with this kind of pure, comedic adrenaline. And, at the heart of this kind of magnificent creation is Gene Wilder's, career defining performance outside of Willy Wonka, of course, as Dr. Frederick Frankenstein, Frankenstein. I think is it Frankenstein, or is he in? Yeah, so that's how it's Frankenstein. But so Gene Wilder, he co-wrote the screenplay here, and you can kind of feel his DNA in the character's every twitch and tremor. And we first meet him as this man of science, this respectable lecturer, just desperately trying to escape this shadow of his cuckoo grandfather. Um, and Gene Wilder just plays, Frederick's initial arrogance and denial with this very tightly wound precision that only Gene Wilder could do. And I really that makes his kind of inevitable descent into this kind of magnificent madness all the more hilarious. Just the physical comedy here is just unparalleled. The way his body just kind of contorts with frustration. His voice is cracking into this kind of hysterical shriek, and just, his eyes widen with this very dawning, gleeful insanity is just a masterclass of acting. The moment that he finally, reads his grandfather's journal and screams, "It could work," is not just, a line reading. It's just the glorious, birth of a new Frankenstein, and Gene Wilder sells it just with every fiber of his being. Um, but, a mad scientist is nothing without his laboratory assistants, and Young Frankenstein boasts arguably the greatest comedic ensemble ever assembled for a Frankenstein inspired film. Marty Feldman's Igor is not Igor, it's Igor. It's just a kind of a force of chaotic nature. He's got those big bug eyes, like Marty Feldman always known for. This very mischievous grin, and just and a hunchback that just famously shifts sides. Marty Feldman is this comedic wild card of the film, just a perfect counterpoint to Gene Wilder's, mania. And he has all these ad lib lines, like the legendary, walk this way. And so then they're all walking like the same way down through the room, and it just has become this really part of the cinematic lore. And then you got Cloris Leachman's Frau Blucher is this very triumph of deadpan comedy menace. Just every utterance of her name is punctuated by this terrified um, horses, like I can't. Sorry, I can't do I can't imitate a horse, but you know what I mean. Like it always has that horse sound whenever someone says her name, which is just a running gag that just never once fails to land. Um, so, she delivers, lines like, "Yes, he was my boyfriend," with this very, terrifyingly straight face, and just, creates a character who's both, genuinely unnerving and just, I mean, side-splittingly funny. I mean, her character is just funny as hell in this. And then we have this dynamic duo of Terry Garr as this sweet, yodeling Inga, and then you have the incomparable Madeline Kahn, who we just talked about not long ago when we were reviewing Clue. But she plays, she's Frederick's high-strung fiance, Elizabeth. And Terry Garr is just the perfect comedic foil. Her wide-eyed innocence and that kind of impeccable timing, providing a grounded, human element amidst the kind of Transylvanian madness. But Madeline Kahn, however, is this very comedic supernova. Her portrayal, the hands-off, socialite who just, eventually discovers the monster's enormous charms, is just nothing short of brilliant. Her transformation from shrieking terror to this operatic ecstasy. Oh, sweet mystery of life, at last I found you. It's one of the film's most, I think, audacious and unforgettable sequences. I love it. But, and one cannot forget the monster himself, though. Peter Boyle had the monumental task of just, following in Boris Karloff's, iconic footsteps. But he does so with this very surprising heart and comedic grace. And I love Peter Boyle, and his monster is just, this frightened, misunderstood child, and he just conveys, this role, beautifully. Whether he's flailing in terror at the sight of a lit match, or just being duped by Gene Wilder's just lonely, not Gene Wilder, Gene Hackman's Lonely Blind Hermit, just where he was, like how they're kind of paying tribute there to Bride of Frankenstein with that scene. It just really he really earns our sympathy with the role, and this kind of emotional core, culminates in the film's, just show-stopping centerpiece when you have Dr. Frankenstein and the monster doing this song and dance number to Putting on the Ritz. And it's just this kind of sequence, just such absurdity and it's perfect execution that it just really encapsulates everything that's wonderful about the film. Just, the sight of Gene Wilder's, top-hatted doctor and Boyle's grunting, gargantuan creature just performing this kind of synchronized tap routine is just a moment of just pure unadulterated joy. I know it probably sounds stupid on paper, but if you watch the film, you know exactly what I mean and how awesome and memorable it is. But what really elevates Young Frankenstein from a great comedy to an all-time classic, excuse me, is this kind of alchemy of humor. It blends sophisticated wordplay like werewolf, their wolf, their castle, and it fits my type of humor perfectly. Just these brilliant sight gags like the enormous Schwanstucker, you know, if you know what that is. It just unforgettable running jokes like with the Frau Blucher, the horses screaming or whatever. It's just very character driven humor, just with flawless precision. Um, Yet beneath the laughter, there's a very genuine affection for the characters and the story of Frankenstein itself. The film explores themes of legacy and destiny and just that fine line between genius and madness. And Frederick's journey is just not just a comedic one. It's about accepting who he is. Embracing his heritage and just realizing that his grandfather wasn't just a madman but a brilliant pioneer. um, and the legacy and the impact of Young Frankenstein is immeasurable. Its placement on countless funniest movies of all time, which is no doubt on one of my funniest movies of all time. Just those kinds of lists from institutions like the American Film Institute is merely just a formality. Its true legacy lives in the way it set the gold standard for parody. It proved that a spoof could be intelligent and artful and just emotionally resonant. It taught a generation of filmmakers that the best satire comes from a place of deep love and understanding. And in 2003, actually, its selection for the preservation in the Library of Congress National Film Registry solidified its status not just as a comedy classic, but as a culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant piece of American art. And even Mel Brooks himself has called it his finest film, as a writer director. And it may very well be my favorite Mel Brooks film of all time. I mean, it's neck and neck with Spaceballs for sure. But Mel Brooks has said that it's his finest film as a writer, a director, just which is a sentiment for which I could wholeheartedly agree with. Um, but, in conclusion, Young Frankenstein is a perfect organism, a creature stitched together from the best parts of classic horror and vaudevillian humor and just brilliant character acting. And then it's all jolted to life by, these twin creative lightning bolts of Mel Brooks and Gene Wilder. It's a film that I can watch 100 times and still find myself laughing every single time. And just the nuances in a performance, just a new appreciation every time for its visual artistry. It's a comforting, hilarious, and just endlessly rewarding experience. It is more than just a movie that you watch. I feel it's a movie you love. And it makes me feel alive. It's alive. It's alive. So and thankfully for film lovers everywhere, it always will be that way. Um, which now brings me to the next film on this list, which is a very, very different inspired film from the original Frankenstein story. Probably one of the most unique and Frankenstein inspired films that you will ever watch in your life. And ironically, we are celebrating Mary Shelley's birthday, which was yesterday. But 2 days ago, the man who made this film that we're about to talk about celebrated his 75th birthday. A man that I've met on more than one occasion at this point at horror conventions. Um, and that's Frank Henenlotter. And so this next film we're going to be talking about is Frankenhooker from 1990. And, in those kind of hollow, sticky floored halls of cult cinema, there are films that shock, there are films that amuse, or films that simply just defy, categorization. And then there's Frank Henlotter's Frankenhooker, which is a film that just manages to do all three of those things with such a very gleefully depraved and audacious spirit that it stands as this kind of towering, stitched together monument to B movie brilliance. And this is absolutely my favorite Frank Henenlotter film. So, to the uninitiated, the title alone might suggest a very disposable, one joke schlock fest. But I think for fans of Frank Henlotter's unique brand of urban grime horror, Frankenhooker is nothing short of a masterpiece. A vibrant, pulsating, and it's hilarious satire that embodies everything that makes his work so enduringly special. And Henenlotter, the filmmaker of 42nd Street Sleaze, who gave us the symbiotic terrors of Basket Case and that parasitic addiction of brain damage, completes this unofficial trilogy of New York-based body horror with Frankenhooker. And while his previous films were kind of steeped in darker, more psychologically unsettling brand of horror, this film sees him lean fully into the comedic potential of his kind of grotesque premises. The result is a film that just less about scares and more about the sheer unadulterated joy of its own absurdity. The story, which is just a gloriously twisted take on Mary Shelley's classic, introduces us to Jeffrey Franken, who's played with just this perfect, blend of bug-eyed intensity and deadpan lunacy by James Lorenz. Jeffrey is a medical school dropout, just living in suburban New Jersey. He's a self-styled bioelectrician with just a basement full of these buzzing gizmos, and just he's got this beautiful fiance Elizabeth, played by Patty Mullen, um, and his character is established immediately as this very lovable, although deeply weird guy, and his idea of a perfect evening is showing off this disembodied brain that he's zapped back to semi consciousness. And James Lorenz's performance is just a masterclass in B movie anchoring. He delivers lines about self preparation with a power drill to just to let the pressure out or whatever what he says, with just the same kind of nonchalant energy as someone discussing the weather. I used that analogy earlier as well with Peter Cushing, but he's our guide into this mad world, and his tragic, misguided devotion is the strangely sincere heart of the film. So the inciting incident is this moment of just pure slapstick gore that really sets the tone for everything that follows. So Elizabeth is just tragically and hilariously shredded to bits by this remote controlled lawnmower that Jeffrey has created, and in the aftermath, with Jeffrey cradling her severed head at a dinner table that was set for two, is this kind of perfect distillation of Henlotter's genius. It's tragic, it's grotesque, it's laugh out loud funny, all at once. And so he's driven by grief, and this he has this Frankenstein complex. Jeffrey hatches this plan that he will rebuild Elizabeth. He has her head, he just needs a perfect body. And where does one find a selection of premium female body parts in 1990? Well, New York City's thriving population of prostitutes, of course. So this is where the film dives headfirst into its kind of satirical core. So Jeffrey's quest takes him into this neon-soaked, grimy underbelly of Times Square, which is a world that's populated by these colorfully clad sex workers and their volatile crack dealing pimp Zorro. And the film's social commentary, while delivered with kind of subtlety of a sledgehammer, is just a brilliant time capsule of the late 80s and early 90s, like war on drugs, hysteria, or whatever. But inspired by news reports of crack related deaths, Jeffrey invents this super crack, which is a potent substance that causes its users to literally explode. And his plan is to host a pimp's ball of sorts, I guess you could say. And select the body parts that he needs, and then detonate the women. Justifying his actions with that warped logic that they were probably going to die from drugs anyway. The ensuing scene is one of the most iconic moments in exploitation cinematic history. And this hotel room, picture this hotel room filled with prostitutes descends into chaos as they discover this super crack. And Jeffrey's pleas are ignored as they all take a hit, leading to this very symphony of just detonating flesh everywhere. It's a showcase for special effects work, and its artist Gabe Bartalos, who has worked with Frankenhooker multiple times on his films and effects. So you got this confetti of limbs and just popping eyeballs that is both stomach churning and just cartoonishly hilarious. Frank Henenlotter, does not shy away from the gore. He just revels in it, basically. Staging these explosions with just the glee of a pyromaniac in a fireworks factory. It's outrageous. It's tasteless, honestly, but utterly unforgettable, and I love it. I love every bit of it. But so just from this collected, color coded bags of body parts, Jeffrey stitches together his new creation. And when the lightning strikes, Elizabeth is reborn as the title character, Frankenhooker. So Patty Mullen's transformation is the film's piece de resistance. That once sweet girl next door, Elizabeth, is now this lumbering, twitching creature in a purple corset and fishnets, and her face is just a contorted mask of her former self. I wonder if I can. I'm gonna try to do the Frankenhooker face. She's like, she just like kind of like I can't do it. It's crazy how it's like she moves her mouth to the side and stuff. But her movements are this kind of very macabre dance. She's very stiff and jerky all over the place, and almost puppet like. Her vocabulary is just a fractured collection of the last words of the women whose bodies that she now inhabits, um, which kind of results in this very iconic, endlessly quotable lines like, "Want a date? Got any money?" You know, it's just her performance is just a very physical triumph. Just turning the Frankenhooker into this very tragic, um, comical, and just strangely alluring monster. When her clients get too close, they're electrocuted in this shower of just sparks, which is another just brilliant display, of the film's practical effects wizardry. Um, and the final act descends into even greater chaos, and involving a vengeful Zorro. And a reanimated mass of just leftover body parts that forms this multi-limbed creature in a cooler. And it just all culminates in a very truly inspired, gender swapped ending that just feels both shocking and really honestly perfectly in line with that film's kind of twisted sense of justice and humor. Um, but Frankenhooker was never destined for any kind of mainstream success. It was too weird, too gory, and just too gleefully offensive. For just the multiplexes of 1990. However, its legacy was just forged like a lot of other films I talk about on here. In the video stores and just the programming of like late night television. It quickly became this cult classic, which is a film that passed between fans like kind of a sacred text of schlock. Um, and its impact really lies in its unapologetic embrace, of its own identity. In this era when horror was just increasingly dominated by slashers and a lot slicker productions, Frankenhooker was this kind of proud throwback to that grindhouse, exploitation films of the 1970s. Um, just filtered through uh, Henenlotter's kind of uniquely comic and grotesque lens, I guess you could say. It definitely sits comfortably alongside Basket Case and Brain Damage as just a defining work of Henenlotter's career. And it showcases his talent for just kind of creating these empathetic monsters and just finding a lot of dark humor in the most taboo subjects. And I think that's why I absolutely love Frank Henenlotter, and I regard him as one of my favorite horror directors of all time, because um, he just put so much creativity into his films, and it lined up and felt so relatable to my type of humor growing up. I just couldn't get enough of his films. Um, and this film's blend of just extreme gore and social satire and just slapstick comedy just really helped pave the way for other horror comedies that came after this, that weren't afraid to push boundaries. And today, thanks to these pristine restorations from like these boutique Blu-ray labels like Arrow Video, and Synapse Films, and the studios like that, Frankenhooker has found just this very new and appreciative audience, thanks to physical media. It's no longer just this grainy VHS memory, but just a celebrated piece of outsider art. It's aesthetic, it's humor, it's just that sheer audacity. It really feels more refreshing than ever in today's often very sterile and overly serious cinematic landscape. But to review Frankenhooker is just to celebrate the art of the outrageous. It is a film that was made with just infectious passion from Frankenlotter, a deep love for the horror genre, and just a complete disregard for a polite society. From James Lawrence's perfectly unhinged performance to Patty Mullen's iconic creation, from the spectacular practical effects to the razor sharp if crude satire, every element works in perfection here, and this very and this in harmony. You know what I mean? Um, Frank Henlotter didn't just make a movie with a clever title. He crafted this lightning bolt of just pure, unadulterated cinematic joy, to me and to so many others that are fans of this film. It's a film that just reminds us that sometimes, the most beautiful creations are the ones stitched together from the best, most, the best parts. If you want a date with a true horror comedy classic, then look no further than Frankenhooker. Just be sure to maybe bring some money and maybe wear some rubber gloves. Um, Sorry, that's a bad joke. But, I always often wonder too, like, because this film was inspired by the original Frankenstein novel and all the Frankenstein films that came before it. But I always wondered, like, what would Mary Shelley think of Frankenhooker? And honestly, I mean, just based on everything that I've read about Mary Shelley's life, I feel like she would love it. I feel like that it would definitely be something right up her alley, and it should be yours too. If you've never seen Frankenhooker, definitely go check it out at some point. But that now brings me to the last film that we'll be talking about for tonight, and because we are celebrating Mary Shelley's birthday, what better way than to end this with uh, the the film that came out in 1994 that bared her name in the title, and that's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So in this kind of vast and often storied landscape, of these adaptations, there are few literary works that have just been as frequently revisited um, as Mary Shelley's 1818 masterpiece, Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. So, for decades, just the public consciousness was dominated by the iconic, just yet fundamentally unfaithful image of Boris Karloff's, lumbering, groaning monsters, and all the other actors that would portray the monster, during that time frame of the Universal era, with like Lon Chaney Jr. and Glenn Strange and Bela Lugosi, and just that monster became this cultural touchstone, and to but this kind of shadow of the articulate and tragic, philosopher that Mary Shelley had conceived. And then in 1994, Kenneth Branagh, I think is how you say his last name, he's this filmmaker, synonymous with just kind of a Shakespearean passion, just affixed Mary Shelley's name to his title and just promised a return to the source. So the result, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, was met with kind of a mix of mixed reviews and just kind of commercial disappointment. But yet, for those of us, who hold Mary Shelley's novel as kind of this sacred text of Gothic literature, um, the film from 1994 is not merely an adaptation. It is really this brilliantly breathtaking, operatic, and just emotionally, you know, cinematic symphony that, despite its theatrical, failure, sort of, I guess, and just you could say, but and just kind of the narrative deviations, it really captures, that tormented soul of the novel more, more faithfully than any film, before or since. And I think the film's greatest triumph lies in its kind of unwavering commitment to the novel's central tragedy, that of the creator, not just the created. And the director here, just pulling double duty as a director and the star, presents a Victor Frankenstein who is not just this cackling madman in a sterile laboratory, but this passionate, grief-stricken romantic hero consumed by these Promethean pride. And his quest to conquer death is born not a pure scientific curiosity, but just from the raw, unprocessed trauma of watching his mother die in childbirth. This motivation, established early on, infuses his ambition with a desperate, relatable humanity. And when Victor, vows on his mother's grave to defeat mortality, we understand that fire that drives him. And Branagh's performance is I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. I'm sorry if I'm not. But, his performance is a whirlwind of just manic energy. He is just perpetually, running, shouting, sweating. His hair's a mess. His eyes are wide with obsession. Just critics at the time, often derided this as not good, like it was like bad acting. Um, but it's pitch perfect, for Mary Shelley's kind of feverish prose. Victor Frankenstein, he is a man that's just of unbound passions, and Branagh's direction just mirrors this. Employing these kind of sweeping crane shots, and just this very the score, the beautiful score done by Patrick Doyle, and just a kind of a frantic editing pace that plunges the audience directly into that vortex of Victor's collapsing psyche. And the creation sequence itself is like a masterclass in this kind of type of approach, and stripping away the kind of sanitized lightning bolts of that Universal brought us. Branagh gives a visceral kind of pseudo scientific nightmare, and the laboratory is just these steaming copper vats, and just these crackling kind of electrical conduits, and just vats of amniotic fluid. And Victor, is stripped to the waist like a pagan god, birthing a new world. He just manually cranks his creation to life, and is just a very messy, physical and just profoundly unsettling sequence that just captures that sheer arrogance and that transgressive, horror of the act. He's not merely just flipping a switch or whatever. He's actively wrestling life from the clutches of death, and just the film really makes us feel that the weight of that sin. And of course, the heart of any Frankenstein adaptation is its monster, or, as he is more accurately called here, the creation. And they casted Robert De Niro, who was an actor, known for just his intense, acting ability. Just with it was a stroke of genius casting him. So he's buried under layers of these scar tissue. De Niro, he delivers this performance of just heartbreaking nuance. His creation is not this brute, but this kind of um, pitiful soul just born into a world of pain and confusion. And his first moments are just kind of tangled in chains, and it's just very slick with fluid, or just this is a very terrifying depiction of a consciousness violently thrust into existence. um, his journey from this primal state to this eloquent, tormented being is really the film's emotional core. So the sequence where he finds shelter with the one family is just is a beautiful, like, patient rendering of the novel's most poignant chapters. We watch him learn to read, to speak, and to feel empathy, only just to have it all violently ripped away, by that prejudice of those that he sought to love. And when he finally confronts Victor, on the sea of ice, his famous line from the novel, "I do read." It just lands with this kind of force of indictment. This is Mary Shelley's creature, intelligent and suffering, and just driven to vengeance only after being denied love and acceptance at every turn. And De Niro's sorrow and rage are palpable here. He is the tragic hero of the story. A victim of his father's ultimate abandonment. And while the film adheres closely to the novel's structure for its first two acts, at least, retaining the crucial Captain Walton framing device that so many adaptations discard, it is the third act where Branagh makes his boldest and most controversial creative leap. So in the novel, the creature's murder of Elizabeth on her wedding night is the final soul shattering blow from which Victor never recovers. The film, however, pushes this tragedy into the kind of realm of opera. So, consumed by a grief that eclipses, even his initial obsession, Victor races Elizabeth's body back to his laboratory, determined to undo his ultimate failure. So he resurrects her, stitching her head onto the body of the unjustly executed Justine. And this sequence is admittedly a shocking departure from the text. Um, Yet, from the perspective of a fan, it works as a horrifyingly logical extension of the novel's themes. Um, it is just that absolute pride within Victor. He's learned nothing. His sin is not just creating life, but his refusal to take responsibility for it. So, in resurrecting Elizabeth, he doesn't restore his love. He desecrates her memory, turning her into this grotesque parody, of herself, just a mindless, stitched together puppet. And Helena Bonham Carter's performance in these final moments is terrifying and tragic. So when the creation appears, claiming her as his long promised bride, the confrontation between the two fathers over their child is electric. And Elizabeth's final act of agency, realizing the horror of her own existence and choosing that self-immolation, is just a devastatingly powerful climax. It is a moment of just that pure gothic horror that, while not Mary Shelley's text, is profoundly true to Mary Shelley's spirit of tragedy and transgression. And beyond those lead performances, the film is just populated by a by who's who of just British character actors who lended a sense of just a sense of beauty, really. Ian Holm is this gentle and dignified Baron Frankenstein. John Cleese, offers a very surprisingly sober and chilling turn as Professor Waldman, and just the production design here is just immaculate. From the cozy warmth of the Frankenstein Manor in Geneva to the grimy cholera-ridden streets of Ingolstadt, and the sublime, terrifying beauty of that Arctic waste. Every frame is just drenched in atmosphere, which is a very rich tapestry of romanticism and decay. Um, and 30 years on, since this film was released, or actually, yeah, over 30 years now, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein just deserves a serious reevaluation. Perhaps its earnest, hard on its sleeve passion was out of step, with the cynical irony of the 1990s. It's not a subtle film. It's a film with kind of grand gestures, raw emotions, and just that kind of operatic tragedy. But Mary Shelley's novel is not subtle either. It's a desperate, passionate cry from the heart about creation, responsibility, and um, loneliness, and just the monstrousness that lurks within humanity itself. And Kenneth Branagh's film really understood this. It embraced the novel's fire, its intellectual depth, and just its profound sadness. It is a scarred, ambitious, and just deeply moving work of art that stands as the definitive, cinematic tribute to one of literature's greatest stories of all time. Which is a thunderous, heartbreaking, and beautiful monster in its own right. Um, and yeah, I absolutely love Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I just love, not just the movie from '94, but just the novel itself and everything that has inspired for decades upon decades upon decades. And like I said, I grew up is just so drawn to the Gothic lifestyle and that culture, and the music, and just the fashion and everything about it. And and a lot of that is all thanks to the godmother of goth, and that's Mary Shelley. And said, such an inspiration for so many, including myself. And I just want to wish happy birthday to Mary Shelley, 228 years later after her birth. And I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of the 500 movies in 2025. I had a lot of fun talking about these films and rewatching a lot of these films this past week. The only one out of all these films I talked about that I had never seen before was The Horror of Frankenstein, and it ended up being one of my favorite Frankenstein films that I've ever watched. So yeah, and I highly recommend all of these films that I've talked about tonight. So if any of you watching have never seen these films before, definitely take the time, seek them out, give them a chance, see what you think about them. Let me know, and just come back to me and to this video and go in the comments. Let me know what you thought about these films after you've watched them, or if you've already seen them. Let me know in the comments below what you think about them. Which one of these that I talked about tonight is your favorite? But anyway, I want to thank everyone who either watched this live and was here in the chat, or if you're watching this on replay. I really appreciate you guys more than you know. So like I said, please drop me a comment below on what your favorite Frankenstein film is. If it's one of these that I talked about tonight, if it's one of these that I haven't talked about, or one of the ones I've talked about in the past from the Universal Monster series, just let me know. Let me know. Let's talk about it. And as always, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate that. If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button below. I would really appreciate that. It would help me out a lot. Um, and as always, click that bell for any future notifications for videos here on the channel. But with all that said, I'm Crater. This is Crater Mania. I love you guys, and have a good night.